So the objectives today will be to appreciate composting as a process of recycling, to indicate how it can help promote healthy soil and mitigate climate change, to recognize that there's a range of composting practices that are usable on different scales and different environments, and to understand the compost pile as a complex ecosystem. So the topic breakdown, I'm going to talk about two topics. First off, why compost, and a little bit of the science of composting, and then I'll turn it over to Joey to talk about the nuts and bolts of composting, to talk about vermiculture as a variant form of composting, and to talk about composting, most importantly, as a scalable activity. And you've already heard that he's accustomed to dealing with a couple acre operation. And so some of these things will apply in different forms according to your situation. So looking at how various organizations view composting, the Natural Resources Defense Council emphasizes the concept of recycling organic matter. The Northeast Recycling Center emphasizes the concept of generating soil additive. And both of these are equally valid. So first of all, let's deal with composting as a form of nutrient recycling. And when we talk about recycling, we think about a lot of things. Usually we don't think of composting, but in fact, there are almost 300 million tons of municipal solid waste generated yearly in the United States. And of this, 15 or 20% comes from yard waste. And increasingly, many municipalities are putting out green barrels and giving you the opportunity to recycle or to compost this waste along with food waste. And it turns out there are something like 60 million tons yearly of food waste, of which only 6% is donated for human consumption and maybe 5% composted. So all of these things can be addressed through municipal composting. The typical household puts out about a little over 300 pounds of solid waste per month, of which about 40% is organic waste. And the question is, why do we want to keep things out of the landfills? So for one thing, the things that are put into a landfill don't stay there. First of all, we have various kind of gases that are emitted, some of which are greenhouse gases such as methane, as well as decomposition gases that give landfills their distinctive aroma. And in addition to which, and a little less obvious to the neighbors may be, that there are nitrates that are percolating down into groundwater and potentially contaminating groundwater. So this is not a desirable situation, and we want to minimize it to the extent possible. So what about nutrient recycling? Well, just for a little bit of a kind of wonky background, we'll talk about the fact that there are recognized to be 17 essential plant nutrients, some of which are micronutrients that are used in very small quantities, some of which are macronutrients. Of the ones we talk about the most, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, plants are able to get those fairly easily from either air in the case of carbon dioxide or from the soil in the case of water. However, when we start talking about nitrogen, which is a very important component of plant growth, even though it's almost 80% of the atmosphere, it can't be used directly by plants. And just to explore this graphically, here's the nitrogen cycle. And believe it or not, this is a simplified version. And it would be great if the nitrogen in the atmosphere could be used directly by plants. However, the fact of the matter is it can't. And in fact, it's actively lost from the soil and from plants into the atmosphere. So we have a situation that's been described as the equivalent of a leaky pipe. Plant usable nitrogen is continuously being lost, and it's going to be the nutrient that's going to be most likely to show up as being deficient in your gardening soil. So how can we somehow replenish the nitrogen cycle? Well, one way is nature's worked out a very clever way of what's called fixing nitrogen, that is turning it from a form that's not usable by plants into a form that's usable through the action of bacteria in root nodules, particularly of legumes. And this is a good reason to do cover cropping and to reincorporate the matter into the soil. And Joey's going to talk a bit about what he calls in place or in situ composting. The other thing is that there's actually a compost kind of cycle, a nitrogen cycle that's going on in the soil naturally. And this is something that we can feed by accelerating the decomposition process in a compost pile. But also we need to recognize the fact that sterile soil is not the same as healthy soil. So there are many microorganisms that are present and macroorganisms for that matter that are present in the soil that are beneficial and in fact essential to environmental health. Okay, what about the other macronutrient we were talking about? We were talking about carbon and carbon dioxide in particular. And we have kind of a love-hate relationship with carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is first and foremost not only something that we exhale when we do cellular respiration, but it's also a product of burning or combusting carbonaceous materials. And unfortunately, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon-based material, whether it be coal or petroleum, its consumption has gone up. And we've become painfully aware of the fact that when carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, it creates a situation in which sunlight, which has bounced off the surface of the earth and is re-radiated as infrared or heat energy, can be trapped. This has manifested itself in some rather dramatic changes in the atmospheric chemistry. This is a graph going back 800,000 years showing cyclical changes in carbon dioxide. They're able to determine this because carbon dioxide is entrapped in air bubbles in glacial ice. And somewhere around 1960, they were able to splice that curve with a second curve from instruments, particularly in Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. So I'm bringing your attention to that inflection point where the red arrow is, and then I'm going to blow up that last section. And this represents basically the time from 1960 to 2020. The inflection point, it's been a point has been made that we've never had levels, at least within the time frame I'm referring to, we've never had levels in excess of 300 parts per million prior to 1950. And as you see, over the last 70 years, it has gone up steadily. We unfortunately, within the last few months, have exceeded 420 parts per million. So I can honestly say that during my lifetime, the background carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have gone up by 40%. And that's rather dramatic. So depending upon your perspective, you may or may not be motivated to do something about this. One of the few things we can do as gardeners is to grow plants, because growing plants incorporate carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. So that's all well and good. Many plants are perennials, and that's a kind of a long-term solution. Many plants are annuals, however. And what do we do with those plants when they die? Do we just allow the carbon to evolve out of the material, or do we retain it in the soil in the form of compost? So this is a beneficial thing we can do for the environment to compost material. So how does it affect the health of the soil? Well, something that comes as a surprise to many people is when we think of soil, we think of it as a solid medium. But in fact, the reality is healthy soil that's not been compacted actually should only be about 50% solid material. The rest of the space should be pore space, which is utilized for the movement of water and for the movement of gases in and out of the soil. We already talked about how in order to reach the root nodules for nitrogen fixation, that the atmosphere has to have access to the soil. So we talk about pore space. One of the ways to maintain pore space is to have a nice mixture of different size mineral particles, sand, the largest being sand, middle size being silt, and the smallest being clay. But the reality is, and we did a survey just a few months ago amongst master gardeners in Contra Costa County, and we found that 80% of them indicated that the native soil in where they live is clay. And clay, unfortunately, has fairly poor properties when it comes to drainage and aeration. Another 10% sandy soil, which has good drainage and aeration. Another 10% loamy soil, which tends to be very fertile soil. So what do we do if we're stuck with a heavy soil that has a tendency towards compaction, that doesn't allow good passage of air and water? Well, we can lighten it. It's really not practical to add sand to clay or to add silt to clay, because all of these things are very high density, and it's simply not a practical thing to do to change what we call, technically speaking, the texture of the soil. But we can change its structure, and we can do that. We can lighten the soil and increase the pore space by adding organic material in the form of compost. So how does composting work? Well, 4 ingredients, and this, you're going to see this again in Joie's presentation. I actually stole it from him. 4 ingredients: nitrogen, carbon, water, and air. And we refer to the feedstocks, which is mostly yard waste, but also can include food waste, as browns and greens. And browns are relatively high in carbon. So this would include mature dried vegetation, would include things that might come out of a pulp mill, like paper towels, cardboard, those types of materials, very high in carbon. And then sawdust, as long as it's untreated wood, would be a high carbon material. When we, finally, sorry, meant to mention, rice hulls and other grain waste. When we talk about greens, we're talking about compounds. Actually, they have a lot of carbon in them, but they're relatively high in nitrogen. And this would include fresh, undried vegetation. And anybody who has a lawn knows that grass clippings, if you leave them piled up, will heat up all on their own. So they're very high in nitrogen. They have a good carbon nitrogen balance. Coffee grounds and tea leaves, kitchen scraps. It should be uncooked fruit and vegetables. And Joie will talk a little bit about some of the no-nos in terms of types of food that you are going to want to put into a compost pile. Manures from herbivores only, that is not meat-eating animals such as our pet dog and cat. And my favorite, brewery waste. So putting it all together, we have the browns, the greens, adequate amount of water, just right. My rule of thumb is should be like a wet sponge that you've wrung out. Adequate amount of aeration, and Joey will talk about turning the compost pile. And then the participation of both macroorganisms like springtails and earthworms and so on, as well as microorganisms. And one thing I want to point out here is the microorganisms in particular, they have, it's a big job for them to penetrate a large piece of vegetation. So one recurring theme you're going to hear about is cutting things up into small pieces to increase their surface area and increase the penetration and speed up the composting process. So I mentioned before that freshly cut grass will heat up on its own. What we can say is that warmth radiating from the compost pile is a sign that the microorganisms are at work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joey, and Joey is going to talk to us about the how of composting.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. And the benefits are, reducing, reusing, and recycling nature. It improves our water, root, and air penetration. It increases organic matter and humus. It provides beneficial microorganisms and earthworms, enhances our soil nitrogen, sequesters carbon, provides a habitat for all our beneficial plants and pollinators that provide pollen and nectar for our best friends, the bees and the butterflies. And in nature, compost happens. Passive composting is as simple as an open heap pile. You can take your yard waste and just keep putting it on here, but you never want to put in your kitchen scraps in here because that just is an open invitation for rodents and unwanted pests in your garden. But let this happen. It takes time, but it's no fuss, no muss, and it may take up to a year or more to get some compost. Collecting leaves, and storing leaves. I'll probably visit this a few times, and then composting in place. We'll go over this again too. So this is a neat little 20-gallon metal barrel, perforated, that Dennis kind of invented and put together, and it's pretty masterful, and it protects you from rodents and all the other things, but you just keep adding material as you go along, and voila, you're going to end up with some compost. Again, it's aerated, and if you have those leaves, you could always add carbon on top to just keep any smells that might permeate, but I doubt it with this mechanism. And passive composting with tree leaves. That's what trees, all the deciduous trees that we have surrounding our neighborhood, the liquid ambers, the mulberries, the sycamores, oh God, they provide so much shade, but then in the autumn, their branches, their arms just drop all this material and just provide natural carbon. And please do not blow your leaves away. You want to collect them, shred them, and store them. Trust me, you will be so happy. And if you want real quick entertainment, 18-minute TED Talk by Michael McGrath, Everything You Know About Composting is Wrong. This will be in the reference material, but it's delightful, and it'll inspire you. You need to collect leaves. An active compost pile, this is a little seasonal. We do this through April through November, when we are harvesting most of the material from the beds. In the material, all the material I've been growing in my backyard. But you have this pile here that it needs to be covered, but I'm really kind of like look at these slats and go, this might not be as protective as possible, but this will compost down. This will provide heat. This here comes with a lid. This here I cover with burlap bags, and keep it protected. But this gets real active. There's a big enough, this is over 30 inches in diameter. This can expand up to 4 feet, but this provides you enough area for hot composting. And basically, the nitrogen and carbon, our yard waste, that provides the two ingredients that all we have to do is put a little muscle with turning the pile with air and watering it down as we go. And the more we do this, the faster the compost happens. Just revisiting that carbon and green nitrogen, carbon browns, nitrogen greens, soap, cardboard, newspaper, wood shavings, tree trimmings, and dried leaves, bark, and redwood barks. We went over the garden veggies, flowers and shrubs, and lawn clippings, kitchen scraps, fruits and vegetables, coffee grounds, spent grain from distillers, and we use 5%, no more than 5% of livestock manure. It's cured and dried for 6 months when we do get it from a local stable, but in a 216-gallon collection, we don't use more than 10 gallons of horse manure. So what we do not compost is meats and dairy products. That just invites flies and unwanted other critters. Processed foods that have cooking oils and salts, dog, cat, or pig feces, and any diseased plants. What you do want to avoid, especially if you cannot consistently get temperatures above 140 degrees at a sustained period, it's hard to kill weeds with seeds, and ashes and sawdust from treated wood. You have to be 100%. Listen, ashes and sawdust are great to add in your compost pile if you could be 100% certain there is no varnishing or shellac or any other foreign material like particle board that's in this ashes or sawdust, then use it. But you have to have certainty. If there's any doubt, avoid it. And so once you get started and everything, these compost critters that Dennis was talking about, they like a ratio of 3 to 1, 2 to 1, 1 to 1, because there's no perfect recipe. An ideal compost pile has feedstock with an approximation. So basically, if you have one wheelbarrow, if this is what you have, one wheelbarrow of cut long clippings and one wheelbarrow of carbon material, you shredded your leaves and whatnot, and if that's what's available, that will work. If you have 2 wheelbarrows, it's a little bit better. 3, I believe, is ideal. And this will get you started. But again, there is no perfect recipe, and it's not an exact science. Now, for example, this pile here to the right, this is 24 hours old. And it 24 hours earlier, it was in a bed, rooted, and had already yielded the year's worth of harvest in there. But now that we've cut it down, all that nitrogen that you thought was nitrogen has a lot of carbon in there. As with this pile, here's this artichokes, they're green, and underneath that, there's a whole bunch of other green material. But then there's all this other branches and stuff, because now you have to assess this. How much is that carbon nitrogen ratio? And in my own backyard, when I was doing this, this is poppies, this is chard, and fava beans. But as I chopped it up, I see there's a lot of carbon material in here too. So you have to do this assessment when you go in here, because composting is much as an art as it is science. And no 2 gardens are the same. Materials vary in each pile as the carbon nitrogen ratio. And we use is what is available at the time we start a compost pile. It's what you have in your own backyard. So you have to make that assessment. These kids will do the rest once we get started. If you want to do hot composting, earwigs, pill bugs, and worms, all these microbes, fungi, provide all this microbial activity. When you turn the pile, you could see this. And the more you turn the pile, the more you're going to disperse this evenly out and make it uniform so that if there is any disease materials you want, any unwanted pathogens, you're going to, the heat alone will say goodbye to them, but the good stuff will all come back. So let's get started. Composting in 3 simple steps. We got tools and bins. Let's assess those. Garden material that's available. Making compost, passive and hot. Maintain our compost pile. And these are the bins we have available at the Demonstration Education Garden that we volunteer at in Walnut Creek. This is a barrel tumbler that was donated last year. We were playing with it, but the 200, 300 pounds that we went in there, that was too much weight for this frame. So we had it all reinforced. It's been a busy spring. And now that April's almost over and the tomato sale, we're going to come back and revisit this and play with it some more to get some sustained temperatures in there. These containers here, this one here is a small one, much like the 20-gallon metal container that Dennis had. And then this drawer comes out, you can pull it out and it's great for passive. Just keep turning the pile. And these are big enough. These are modular stacked units. They're over 30 inches in diameter, so you could do hot composting, or you could just use it for the same thing with passive. You decide the energy level that you have to address what material you want to work with. At the Education Demonstration Garden we were at in 2016, when I became a Master Gardener, an Eagle Scout did this project here. These are 4x4x4 compartments, huge. The work was just really demanding. And when any 2 bins were empty, you had to take it out and put it in this one, document, keep records, and go back and forth. And then when we had built up too much stuff, we had to just pull it on the tarp, mix it up here, and throw it back in. But then we've come up with other activities where we can now use it to store finished compost, topsoil, composted leaves, and some livestock manure. But we're not doing that too much. Showing you that material, going back to this, good gosh. These critters are going to do the rest of the work here. Your earwigs, pill bugs, worms, those microorganisms. And this is the microbial activity that happens when you turn the pile. And the more you turn the pile, all this gets dispersed. Now, composting in 3 simple steps: the tools, the bins, the garden material, making compost, passive and hot, and maintaining it. So I was telling you about these bins, but you didn't see it. This is the tumbler. And this was the one that was donated to us. We're reinforced the frame here, and we're going to revisit it this year and get some sustained temperatures there, because this is going to be a fun experimental. These containers here, this bin here is too small. It's much like Dennis's metal container. And you could just do this passive, take this drawer out and put the stuff that's on the bottom, put it on top, and that's a good way to rotate it. And these are modular stacked units, and you could do passive or hot composting in this. They're really good materials. But this is the bins I was telling you about that the Boy Scouts did, the Eagle Scout project. And it was 4x4x4 containers. This was a lot of work, and you heard me go over all this and ramble on about, huh? But anyways, this 3/4 inches, 3/4 cubic yard of finished compost. This is what is stored in these bins now, as well as the topsoil and leaves. But this is probably what we use the most. And you could, any retractable and expandable bin, you could use chicken wire, whatever you use, but these are really easy. They're expandable. They're 3 feet high. That should be the height of anything you use. These, you want it to have the ability to expand 30 inches to 48 inches. And at 48 inches, filled to the top, right here, that's 216 gallons, 1 cubic yard. This was filled to the top. And after a few turns, see how much it's compacted. But once you fill it to the top, you're done. We don't add anything more. You just keep turning it and adding water as needed, and nature happens. So in any given 2 to 8 week period, we'll make at least a half cubic yard, if not more, depending on the material and how it's compacted, in that amount of time. This is portable, easy to maintain, and you can make compost in a hurry. So gathering your material and yard waste. So any given week, this is what we're addressing when we visit the garden, but we need tools to work with. And first and foremost is safety stuff. Gloves, goggles, masks, and ear protections. First and foremost. Secondly, pitchfork and shovel, telescopic shears and pruners, chop, 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 chop. Smallest pieces as you can. And then a wheelbarrow. God, if you have that, that saves you time and it saves your back. A compost thermometers. I've always been told, have a conversation with your garden. Well, this will help you. This is a very important tool to have. And bins, different bins to choose from, and a shredder if you have the need and the material to work with. But in your backyard, this is all you need. In your backyard, if you have anything, this garden weasel. If you're doing passive composting in any one of those containers that have a lid and everything, this really just moves that pile around and everything. This real good activation. Pitchfork and shovel, you'll always have a need for them. You'll use it. If a pitchfork is what you have, this is the way to start in your garden, especially if it's clay, to open that clay up. These shears, this is as good as a shredder. This is what you got. This will cut everything down into small little pieces. Gloves, gloves, gloves. And your communication device to your garden. Compost thermometer. You have that, you're all set to go. At the Demonstration Education Garden, we have an array. We have 2 sheds, one at one end, one at the other end, and both of them are filled with garden tools. We have 6 of each of just every one of these things, and even more. We have the broad fork and all this stuff. And then inside, we also have all your first aid material, our earmuffs, earplugs, protection, eye gear, face masks, and just take care of yourselves. Always have this available. And the shredder. The shredder, there's only 3 of us so far trained on this, and we always have somebody with us when we start it. I would never start this on my own if I was the only person at the garden. So this is where you need a lot of awareness, a lot of attention, because this is a beast and it's loud. So wearing earmuffs really helps. Oh, collecting leaves. Did I tell you about collecting leaves? Yes. Shredded leaves, leaves in your green can, and leaves in any type of container. But collect them, collect them, collect them. Collect them in bags, big, large bags. Collect them. Also, rummage around and go get your coffee grounds from your local coffee shop. They have them, and oftentimes they'll give it to you with some carbon filters as an added boost. These here are coffee husks, very lightweight. I get these from the roaster where we go get our burlap bags, and these are real lightweight. You have to have a mask on when we integrate this into a pile and water it down and mix it up. Water it down and mix it up. But it's a real good little nitrogen booster. Some carbon material here is wood shavings, shredded newspaper, and soap cardboard. The shredded newspaper is a lot like that coffee husk. It'll mat up if you don't mix it up real well. But here's a real extra step that one of the master gardeners developed, and it's really a neat little discovery. Just mixing it up beforehand in a large bucket with coffee grounds. It's a great way to integrate it in your compost pile. Just a beautiful integration. And then we do get about 6 cubic yards of compost manure each year. outside the garden. It's open to the public. Master Gardens can get it too, but we use this very sparingly. And then this is any extra worm castings you might have. I always like adding it to the pile, maybe around the fourth or fifth turn. Out of that 292 million tons per year, now Dennis put 300 million, rounded it off, 60 million tons of food waste is in that number. And that is food waste that could be composted. 60 million tons, over 20%. We just need to improve on that. And only 5% of the food waste nationwide is composted, 5%. We could pat ourselves in the back, Bay Area, because we do 30%, but that's still an anemic figure. And approximately 1% of the households in the United States actively compost, and that's anemic. And only 200 communities in only 18 states have recycling of food waste. And now this information, all this information is from the EPA's 2018. They have no other current data. I keep going online and saying, well, come on, have a 2019 at least. But this is the latest information. So can we go to the next one? Yay. Let's build this cake. We're going to shred and chop up into 2 to 4 inch pieces, combine a layer of materials, water each layer, and mix and toss. And this, this is going to save you a little gym time for those of you who really want to get into this. It's fun, it's doable, and I want to say easy, but the older we get, it's a little bit of effort, but I still do it. Combine your materials, mix it up, water each layer, and here you go. This is a bin we started, and this is about the 3rd or 4th turn, and it had sustained temperatures of over 140 degrees the whole time. You can still see the steam and the microbial activity then here. And here, when we were toning it, you could just see kind of like, okay, we got to need to add water because there is a little bit of dryness and it breaks up real easy. So we just keep turning it and then adding water. And then everything rots. And just to reflect, compost is proof that there is life after death. And this pile here is 2+ cubic yards of zucchini and sunflowers. 24 hours earlier, it had done its job, but still a lot of nitrogen there. And we're going to, and there's other material in here, but we're going to chop this up through the shredder and start this on August 15th. This was bin number 3 of 11 that we did last year. And so August 15th, between August 15th and September 15th, we turned it 10 times. Starting with cardboard on the bottom and then mixing materials. Every you go to the shredded material, throw it in, mixing, filling it up to the brim, and at 4 feet in diameter, 3 feet high, that's 1 cubic yard in 2.5 hours. Done. Yay, team. And here's what happened. August 22nd. This is 1 week later. This started August 15th, August 22nd. Look at that. It's compacted. And look at all the difference that all that green material is. In August 27th, this is all the microbial activity that you can see on the bottom here. Now, September 3rd, look at that richness, that black gold, and it's compacted. And that was 1 cubic yard. And this little short video, this is September 18th. And my good friend, Bobby.
Oh, would you look at this beautiful compost? This is started on August 15th, and today is September 18th. And on the 21st, we're probably going to put this in the garden because it is finished. And look at that, how beautiful that balls up. Perfect moisture, not too wet, not too dry. Nice and warm. oh my God, that is as good as it gets.
Well, we are easily excited and always enthusiastic, and very proud of all the material that we're able to do, reuse, recycle, and create and put right back into the garden to relive again. We take no credit for this. This is under the management of 2 master gardeners, but our compost situation is right next to it, and it's just a blessing to see how this just develops. 650 grapes were harvested in 2020, and this is only 10 vines, 2 rows, 5 vines each. In our orchard, which is right behind it and right next to the compost piling efforts, I'm surrounded by these trees, over 25 assorted fruit trees, citrus trees, tangerines, lemons, limes, apples, prunes, plums, nectarines, persimmons, avocados, all under the care of our orchard manager and a couple of her trusted assistants. And gosh, what beauty there is all year round. And it provides 2,000 pounds of fruit in 2020, 2,000 pounds of fruit. But here is this whole operation. In this whole area here, there's 30 garden beds, all 20 by 5. We had tomatoes and eggplants and peppers and melons and squash, and just an array of material that we grew, and we harvested at the end of the year over 19,000 pounds of fresh produce. And all this found a home to those people in need. It's not our primary purpose, but this was the benefit of what we could do, and what a blessing, putting smiles in our hearts and smiles on everybody's face. And this is just 1 delivery a week. It's fun. Let's get going here. Oh, we're going to start with what? Trees. Ah, those trees are poems the earth writes upon the sky, from Cahill Gibran. But those trees also provide what? Leaves. Leaves. Collect your leaves. And I have to let these leaves set, and this is mulberry. Let them set, and because I can't put wet leaves in here, it just plugs up. But once they, set for 2 or 3 days, I just start shredding them up and put them in. And I collect 2 bins all the way to the top. The shredded leaves, you probably have about 4 or 5 bags, mostly sycamore leaves. So I have no problem with it. And then the passive composting, the no fuss, materials added continuously, length of time decompose depends. It may take up to a year. It's very little work, very little time, and hardly any effort. But again, you might want to have a little container, a little frame to start storing it all. But when you have these opened areas like this, that's an invitation. Rats and mice will get into that. So you never want to put in your kitchen scraps, because those are the things that really attract flies and the mice and the rats. Cover crops. This is something we start in mid-August to early November. And again, it's composting. It's composting in place, because these cover crops improve water, root, and air penetration, because we're going to leave the roots in the ground. It increases the organic matter in the humus. It adds more beneficial microorganisms and earthworms. The earthworms love cover crops. It enhances the soil nitrogen, and this is where you get your soil nitrogen. And this is nitrogen, Vicki. Anybody, this is where you're planting nitrogen, and it sequesters carbon, and it provides the habitat for all those beneficial and pollinators that you have surrounding your garden, that provides the pollen and nectar to feed the bees and butterflies. And you want them all around. And remember, everything rots. But the cover crops, you plant fava beans, mustard, peas, assorted stuff, but all nitrogen fixers. And some of them do even more, especially the mustards. But this is my first year with the fava beans, and I got anxious and said, I'll cut them down before they flower, to make sure I have all this nitrogen content. But this is what the roots look like. I pulled up a couple just to see the pink nodules here. And you cut one in half, and this is all nitrogen here, highly nitrogen. You want to leave that in the earth. Cut this down, and this is high rich. All this leaf material, rich nitrogen. Just chop it up in small pieces, put it right back on top of the bed. And we did the same at the demonstration garden. These were 2 beds, fava beans. Cut them right at the base, took it back to the shredder, shredded them up, took the wheelbarrow and brought them right back in and put them right back on, spreaded it on. And then the compost from the August before, August, September, October before, that black gold we just put on top of this, as see demonstrated here. Now this is this year in my backyard. I have 2 garden beds. This is 7 years in the making. 7 years ago, this was all lawn on thick clay. I mowed the lawn, covered it, and put cardboard on top and mulched it and everything, and been working it ever since. So this is the 7th year, 2 beds, mustard and fava, some fetch and other mixed greens, and then cut them, chopped them up in the smallest little pieces and put them right back on the ground, put them right back in the bed. And then in this bed here, I threw on top of this brown material is the composted shredded leaves. Put it right on top of here. So I put carbon right on top of all this nitrogen. And then on top of that composted leaves, I put the compost from last August right on top, all this black gold, and voila, beautiful garden. And it's been a blessing every year. Nothing but a smile in my heart, and it's fun. It's fun being in the garden, and it saves gym time too, but it provides a real good habitat for worms. Oh, speaking of which, vermicomposting. I'm going to finish up with this. There's 2 mediums that master gardeners prefer. And one is this do-it-yourself shelf storage containers. Pretty easy. I'll show you how to put that together. And the other is a modular stack worm farm, which is really a good application, pretty easy, and it's no fuss. The top piece here is right here. You put your worms, give them some food, put some moist newspaper on top of that, and then all their worm castings go into the second bin here, which is right here. And then on the 3rd bin with this nozzle is the worm leachate, which in the vernacular is worm pee-pee. This is worm poo-poo, worm pee-pee. And if this leachate has a foul odor, you just dump it out and throw it in the drain. But if it doesn't, and you could dilute it 30 to 1, and maybe twice a year, once in spring and once in the fall, just give a little shot to each one of your beneficial plants surrounding your garden. They'll love it. But here's what I use, and a lot of other master gardeners use, is 2 utility storage bins, a drill and a 1/4-inch drill bit, sandpaper to sand off the burrs, gloves, paper to shred, and an egg carton. This is carbon too, but the worms like playing around in these. Spray this bottle with water in your bag of worms. So right here, first off, you want to do right at the top here, drill 1/4 inch holes about 1 inch from the lip and about 3 inches apart. On the bottom, you want to drill about 50 holes, 2 inches apart, like this. And then you want to stack them, the brick in between, so you have a little air space here. So all the worm leachate goes into here and into the bottom container. And then you want to shred a bunch of newspapers, tear them in strips, and provide 3 to 4 inches of fluff for bedding. And you're going to moisten it with water, like Dennis said. It feels like a squeezed wet sponge. And then you're just going to acclimate them little critters, your new pets, for about 2 to 3 days. And then, after about 2 days, you could add the food scraps and distribute even, but you don't have to do much. And believe me, these do not take much care. And we could forget about them for a week, and sometimes 2 weeks, but they survive, they're hardy, and you just feed them your kitchen scraps. It's a great way. You could do this no matter how big your backyard is. And even if you have a balcony, you could do kitchen scraps in a worm bin. They're easy to do. But this is mine. In my transition of wanting to clean it, I washed it out and everything and start all over. Put fresh bedding on the bottom, moistened it, added a little compost soil for the worms and threw them in on top. And I don't need to let them acclimate. They've been through this routine for quite a few times. And then I add a layer of food. Don't give them too much, but enough for a week's worth, because I have a lot of kitchen scraps each week. And then more moist bedding, shredded newspaper, and then a little burlap piece here that is all nice and moistened. But you could use newspaper, you could use any cotton material, cloth. It's pretty simple. And then when you want to harvest the castings, after about 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever it is, but you take it, dump it on your patio on top of some newspaper, let it set in the sun for about an hour, and the worms go down to the bottom. And then you just peel the stuff here from the top, and you mound and mold and separate. And voila, you have worm castings. And then you put the worms back in and start all over again. But the worms castings, they're great to add. We use this in a recipe for planting our tomatoes, just a little bit. And you could dilute it 15, 20 to 1. They're great to give to your plants, just a little spike once or twice a year, once in spring, once in fall, and call it a day. And I'm going to leave you with this. Everything rots. And this is from Rumi, who's a Persian philosopher and poet. The ground's generosity takes in our compost and grows beauty. Try to be more like the ground. So to everyone, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you've come away with something that you might find useful, doable, and put into your garden. And Dennis and I thank Allison and the whole library staff. Karen, thank you so much. We're blessed. We're blessed to have you visit us with us tonight and share tonight. With Garden Smiles, we thank you.